All right, I think we can start. So hello, everyone, and welcome to this Metro Expert Series webinar titled Hybrid Warfare, Fighting Back with Whole of Society Tactics. Permettez-moi également de vous accueillir en français à ce webinaire sur le sujet de la guerre hybride. Mon nom est Marc-Olivier Quentin. Je suis coordonnateur de recherche à la Conférence des associations de la défense. And this webinar is organized by the Conference of Defense Associations, which is based in Ottawa and has been around since 1932. We're an umbrella organization for 40 member associations who represent over 400,000 active and retired members of the Canadian Armed Forces. And our institute is a registered charity organization which conducts research, analysis, and educational programs. But above all else, we're a forum, we're a space where a community of people that care about Canada's role in the world come together for open dialogue, and we try to promote a facts-based, a rational approach to defense and security policy in this country. So for today's webinar, we're very fortunate to have leading experts from the academic world, as well as practitioners with expertise in a variety of fields, including cybersecurity, conflict management, and public policy. And we're very excited about today's conversation and about its timing as well, especially with recent events like the alleged sabotage of the Nord Stream pipeline, which of course could be viewed as part of a kind of hybrid warfare strategy, as a part of a hybrid attack. And this sort of event appears to be happening with increased regularity and also to affect an ever-growing number of sectors beyond the traditional military realm, especially the business sector. And the magnitude of the threat seems to be calling for a reevaluation of the way in which we typically respond to security risks. And in particular, it seems to be calling for a multi-sector approach and for more collaboration between entities that usually operate in silos, that operate independently. So these are some of the issues that we'll be tackling today. And during our conversation today, members of the audience are encouraged to take part in the conversation. You can submit questions to our panelists and moderator using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. And after questions are posted, you'll have the ability to upvote them, and our moderator will then forward the most upvoted question to panelists so they can address them. The final thing I wanted to do before I hand it over to our moderator, Dr. Véronique Fraser, is to thank Metro Supply Chain Group, our signature sponsor for today's event and for the webinar series as a whole. And I also want to thank our premier partner, RBC Insurance, our strategic partners, Dataminer, ADGA, KPMG, Lockheed Martin, Logistic Unicorps, Raytheon, and Thales. And finally, our operational partners, namely ATCO, AWS, Microsoft, Pratt & Whitney, and C-SPAN. So without further ado, I will hand it over to our moderator, Dr. Fraser, who will be moderating today's discussion. So Véronique Fraser is a professor at the Faculty of Law of the University of Sherbrooke, and she's also a member of Project SECHAT, which is an international network of experts who are engaged in efforts to study and respond to the emerging threat of hybrid warfare. And Project SECHAT is our partner for today's event, and they've been very helpful in organizing and spreading the word about this webinar. So thank you very much for that. And Dr. Fraser, over to you now.
Thank you, Marc-Olivier. So hi, everyone. And first, we'd like to thank the Conference of Defense Association Institute for the invitation. And also a particular thanks back to you, Marc-Olivier, for organizing and coordinating the webinar. You've been extremely useful. We're here today to talk about some of the preliminary reflection of Project SECHAT. Project SECHAT is a multinational group organized to study and respond to the rising threats of what we call hybrid warfare, or gray zone conflict, or again, unrestricted warfare. And these are just three of various terms now in circulation to describe the same phenomenon. which is a tax against a country such as Canada and other democracies that have serious implications for its national security and defense institutions. The range of such attacks is broad and varied, and the challenge is that they're constantly being renewed in new forms. And they may include military elements, but may also be mounted using cyber tools, public and commercial corruption, weaponization of legal systems, transnational organized crime, disinformation campaigns, along with a host of other methods. Project CSHAT particularly focuses on the relationship between hybrid warfare and the relevant dealings of many crimes involving private companies and other domestic entities. We're talking here about NGOs, universities, hospitals, municipalities, and more that tend not to have the resources of national governments to respond to these attacks. What we want to do in the next hour, we want to describe the current global hybrid warfare threats and how they impact Canada and especially the private sector. In particularly, our panelists will assess how the Canadian Armed Forces and other Western militaries are currently equipped to face these emerging threats. They will also stress the need for enhanced cooperation and knowledge distribution between the armed forces and other entities with which they generally have very little contact. And at the end of this webinar, we'd like to launch a discussion, basically a global dialogue with you, the audience, on pragmatic and holistic strategic considerations in confronting these contemporary threats that impact not only security and intelligence, but also law offices, businesses, leaders, diplomats, media, and politicians. As far as our panelists, we have the good fortune to have with us 5 panelists that are all members of the CSHAT project and whose combined expertise and backgrounds cover areas of security, conflict management, negotiation, and public policy. And going simply by alphabetical order here, we first have Calvin Krusty, who's a senior partner in Critical Risk Team, which is a consulting firm based in Vancouver and specializing in the human element in cybersecurity. Previously, Calvin served for 33 years with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and after a number of years as the RCMP's chief hostage negotiator, he concluded his career there, leading a large unit combating transnational organized crime and money laundering. Moving on to Stephen Desjardins, who is a retired Canadian Armed Force colonel. He recently completed a 3-year consulting engagement in which he was asked to redesign Canada's defense intelligence enterprise. And prior to this, while serving in the Canadian Armed Forces, Stephen had multiple deployments overseas and for domestic operations. He served as the Senior Intelligence Officer in the Canadian Army and in the Canadian Joint Operations Command, and served a tour as Senior Intelligence Officer for Human Intelligence, Counterintelligence, and Information Security at SHAPE in NATO. He has led numerous transformation initiatives in Canadian national defense and in NATO, most relevantly in kinetic and non-kinetic targeting effects, planning, and counterintelligence. Then we have Chris Honeyman, who is a managing partner of Convener Conflict Management, a consulting firm based in Washington, D.C. He is co-editor of the Negotiator's Desk Reference and 6 other books, and author over 100 published articles, books, chapters, and monographs. He has led or co-directed a 30-year series of research and development programs in conflict management, advised many academic and practice organizations, and served as a mediator, arbitrator, and in other neutral capacities in more than 2,000 disputes. Moving on to Sanda Kaufman, who is Professor Emeritus of Planning, Public Policy, and Administration at Cleveland State University's Levin College of Urban Affairs. Her research spans negotiations and intervention in environmental and public conflict, social environmental systems, resilience, decision analysis, program evaluations, and negotiation pedagogy. And finally, and not the least, Anne Leslie, who is Cloud Risk and Controls Leader Europe at IBM. She has over 15 years experience in international roles in banking, financial regulation, related software businesses. And since joining IBM, her focus has been on accompanying financial institutions in transforming their technology and cybersecurity operations to keep pace with dynamic business, regulatory, and threat landscape. And now let's hear our panel talk about those fascinating issues. So let's start discussion by trying to understand precisely what we're talking about when speaking about hybrid warfare and all its synonyms. And I'd like to start this conversation with Stephen and ask you, from your experience as an intelligence officer, working on counterintelligence and information security with the Canadian Army, the Five Eyes intelligence community, and with NATO, how would you describe in 2 minutes the current global threats as they relate to hybrid warfare?
Merci, Véronique. A complex task to do in 2 minutes and no introduction part. So thanks for being here. And I think that Bob Ray recently described it exceptionally well. We're living in a world of turmoil. In terms of the threat environment and the security environment, we're increasingly seeing a polarized, complex, ambiguous, and dangerous security environment. We're watching it, seeing it, reading it on the news every night. It's quite obvious. We've got intensified, persistent, and increasingly hostile great power rivalry. Again, we're seeing that on a daily basis, where our adversaries are intent on changing the rules-based international order and trying to secure greater influence and prosperity. Although investments in hard power and shooting wars continue and investments are increasing and accelerating, our adversaries are largely keeping hostilities below the threshold of war, which is really that gray zone hybrid warfare space. And that is both to shape future operations that could happen above the threshold, but also to mitigate their own deficiencies and generate efficiencies in the future. So a lot of the conflict or competition happens below the threshold of war, and that's really what we're talking about in terms of hybrid warfare. In terms of the means, our adversaries are not constrained either legally or ethically in the use of all levers of national power. And so they do so globally. They do so at a tempo and intensity of their choosing, and they can fluctuate this. And essentially, their ability to do this is coordinated and synchronized. And so they're pretty effective on how they will shape, posture themselves, and influence the world globally. In terms of active measures that we note and see and experience, obviously there's disinformation and misinformation. That is an acute phenomenon that we're witnessing. There's counterfeiting, sabotage. There's the conduct of discredit operations. There are efforts to destabilize foreign governments. We've seen this recently in Burkina Faso, for example, or in other places. There are false flag operations, provocations, and the manipulation aimed at weakening social cohesion. And we see that obviously quite frequently and globally. The recruitment of useful idiots is an ongoing thing. And the creation of front organizations, whether they be corporations, charities, humanitarian or social groups, those are all some of the active measures that they use. Beyond the evident, overt, and nefarious measures or other measures that include things like corporate acquisition, joint ventures, partnerships, trade and supply arrangements, all means that have a dual purpose, both for economic prosperity and the normal day-to-day life, but it also postures adversaries should they choose to escalate beyond the threshold of war.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Stephen. Do you want to wrap it up in 1 or 2 sentences?
Yeah, so essentially what they're using is a bunch of, what they use are different entities, proxies, contracted service providers, some of it overt, some of it covert. And we see this competition playing out in boardrooms, in councils, in assemblies, and everywhere. So it's not just targeting the public or defense sectors, it's targeting society as a whole. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Stephen. It was a hard question to respond so quickly, but you've done a great job setting up the table for us. So we appreciate. I'd like to move on to Calvin, because Calvin, you combine also a unique experience, having witnessed the impacts of hybrid warfare and the responses to it from your experience working with law enforcement, global affairs, the United Nations, NORAD, the Five Eyes community, but also the private sector. So could you help us understand, again, I'm asking the impossible, but in 2 minutes, the impacts of these global threats on the domestic side as they concern businesses, law firms, domestic governments, etc. And I think your microphone could be turned on. Thank you.
Thanks, Veronique, and thanks, Steve, for giving a good foundational conversation. I'm just going to preface it, my editing bad in terms of the critical risk team. Our work is broader than the cyber. It's in like multi-dimensional issues of risk, and I only share that because it's going to cascade in terms of my response and what we see, and several other responses probably today. But I guess first what I saw was in 2009, roughly, when I was in an intelligence position, I saw a lot of threat activity consistent with hybrid warfare, where we saw state actors engage with transnational organized crime activities in the illicit finance, transnational organized crime, counterproliferation, espionage activities in Canada. Then when I was sitting at the national tables, those weren't the discussions that were taking place, but out in the field, that's what we were seeing back then, and they were being somewhat perhaps because of cognitive dissonance, perhaps politics, I'm not sure what, but there was a difference as to what was happening in the field and what was taking place at national tables, and also a difference between what we were hearing from our Five Eyes partners as to what was going on in the world, and then those same discussions when we were in Ottawa as to what was happening within Canada. And so we saw in about 2015, 2014, an uptick where other state actors started engaging in a more substantial way in terms of engaged in transnational organized crime, illicit finance, counterproliferation, espionage, and then some of the other activities that were going on at that particular time within Canada. And again, there was non-congruence between what was taking place, within our cities and within our communities. Then I transferred and pivoted to the private sector with the critical risk team. And all of a sudden I was sitting there at boardrooms, law offices, and we were seeing even, well, at least the same, even a higher, more acute, escalated, pronounced activity of these same hybrid warfare type activities taking place. And finally, at one point, a senior Canadian politician asked me, in the context of some illicit finance conversations that were taking place within Canada, to do a presentation to a group discreetly of senior political leaders and have a discussion as to what we were seeing in the business community and within the legal community in Canada within the private sector, and to brief them what we were seeing, which was not the same as to what was reported by our security and intelligence to the government. And we briefed, and we took 10 of our cases that we had recently worked on, 4 tied back to Beijing, 2 to Tehran, 1 to Moscow, and the other 2 were cartel. And the questions that were being asked to us is, how are we dealing with them? Why are we dealing with them versus Canadian institutions dealing with them? which raised a whole another series of conversations. But in essential, that's kind of the experience that we've been seeing in the private sector and in the public sector, you know, outside domestically within Canada and within the Five Eyes community.
Thanks so much, Calvin. I'd like to move on to Anne. Working as a senior management consultant in cybersecurity at IBM, you have seen a lot of cases of large corporations being attacked worldwide. And to help our audience understand concretely the type of risk the private sector may face, could you provide us with a couple of concrete examples that affected big businesses?
Sure. So the average person in the public will come across this in the headlines. You know, you'll get a big name international corporation who will have been attacked in some way. And without actually any context, what typically happens in that scenario is that fingers of blame. And we're terrible on that in our industry. We point fingers at the victim. And unless you happen to be sitting in a particular part of a wider ecosystem, you won't know what's really gone on in the background. So the two examples that I'm going to give illustrate why it's important to look at the backstory and why we need to be much better at withholding judgment. Because the way we have a tendency to jump on these things is to point fingers of blame, saying, oh, weren't they derelict in their responsibilities? How negligent can they have been? And it's so much more complex than that. It's a very unhelpful, unconstructive response to point that finger of blame. So if we go back maybe 10 years to 2011, there's a spectacular hack, which from a kind of a case study perspective is well worth looking at, and it's called the RSA hack. Now, RSA is the linchpin, I would say, of the cybersecurity infrastructure in terms of tooling, providing a capability to authenticate users. And what's really interesting was that it was compromised, and it was like taking out the linchpin of a very trusted entity in an ecosystem and how it propagated. And that was, it happened again recently with SolarWinds. It's known as a supply chain attack. And it's how can you wreak maximum havoc, create a completely ambient feeling of insecurity by attacking a single entity that is relied upon by so many others. And they can be private sector companies, they can be public sector. And this attack done by a state level actor, sophisticated, persistent, and it's these kind of characteristics that are very, very important to study in the context of hybrid warfare. This is a long game. The motivations are multiple, but the characteristics of sophistication and persistence are really important. Another one that's worth mentioning is NotPetya. People may have been familiar with that in the headlines. So Maersk, one of the biggest, if not the biggest, shipping company in the world, got their infrastructure, IT infrastructure, totally taken out. And the motivation was not so much around ransom as it was about a demonstration of force. This was sort of collateral damage, huge collateral damage in a conflict between Ukraine and Russia. And a private sector company, a huge private sector company, got absolutely, the damage is just phenomenal. So it's these ramifications of something happening elsewhere, and you get caught up in it. You ask for nothing. You don't even consider that you're involved in it. And yet, as a bystander, your operations actually can be completely wiped out. So those would be two that I think are very illustrative of the impact that can be felt in the private sector, even though they're not necessarily directly involved in a particular conflict.
Thank you so much, Anne. And you've done a good job, all three of you, setting up the table so we understand what we're talking about here. Now we're going to be moving on to assess how currently equipped we are to facing these emerging threats. And I'd like to go back to Stephen and ask you, from your knowledge, and in 2 minutes again, what kinds of responses the Canadian Armed Forces and other Western militaries can offer to these emerging threats?
right. Well, thanks again. So in terms of responses, there's a breadth of, obviously the military defense, we have the hard power piece, but there's also defense diplomacy, and there's a bunch of tools and engagements that can be done to shape and influence and detect threats as they come up. So that's important. I think one of the most important, I think, is the defense or the military's ability to contribute to a comprehensive understanding of what is happening in the world. And so increasingly participating in whole of government fusion, bringing in multiple points of view to achieve a common understanding of the threats, the risks, and the opportunities. I think that is key. And there are a number of efforts being made so that a whole of government and defense contributes to that effectively. In terms of contributing to action, there are efforts to break internal silos, minimize vulnerabilities within the CAF and within defense, and accentuate our ability or their ability to deliver effects. So one of those, for example, is pan or multi-domain approach to C2 and intelligence. So breaking down, making sure that there are no gaps and seams that can be exploited by adversaries to weaken us. Another one is in terms of enabling whole of government strategic communications and being an important lever in that. We've seen the UK defense intelligence entities publishing intelligence reports, and the US intelligence community has done the same thing, and those have disrupted a number of false flag activities in the build-up towards Ukraine. So in terms of specific measures that the CAF can and Western forces can deliver, I think those are the important ones, contributing to the understanding, making sure that all aspects are seen and understood, and then obviously contributing to the actions that can be delivered in support of defeating hybrid activities.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Calvin, I'd like to go back to you, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but from my understanding, it was precisely the concerns that the Western militaries and governments were not adequately positioned to face hybrid warfare threats, particularly as they affect domestic governments in the private sector, that brought you to reach out to Chris and bring together a task force of multidisciplinary experts that make up the Project CSHEP today. So can you tell us more very quickly in 2 minutes what led to the creation of Project CSHEP?
I would say there's two major influencing factors. The first was some of the general work that we were doing in the private sector, particularly with law firms and business groups, in the context of the larger issues relative to the Huawei issues, some peripheral engagement in that particular issue as it tied to the canola dispute, which was being framed as a trade war issue, which I thought was not overly accurate when it was tied to the detention / kidnapping of 2 Canadians and then the pork dispute. And I was engaged with different politicians, different leaders, and people in that particular dispute. And the first thing I recognized was perhaps a lack of appreciation in terms of the larger context of the conflict, which led me to Chris in terms of dispute resolution and conflict management. The second issue that surfaced was, and I alluded to it, was a meeting with a group of politicians who were aware that our particular group, the critical risk team, was engaged in some unique circumstances and cases. And in the context of the politicians' interest, was in the area of illicit finance and threat activities, and what role, if any role, did lawyers play in that particular thing and or in that particular threat activity. And as Anne Leslie alluded to, the attribution blame game always comes up in the conversations. And I think I provided a differential response as to what was anticipated, because I said I didn't think lawyers were particularly as responsible as perhaps the public may think, because of the complexity of our legal system and our framework that wasn't really designed to look at hybrid warfare threats at least within the Canadian context. And as a result,
thanks,
so,
Calvin. I'd like to interrupt here, and if you don't mind, because that would be a perfect lead up to just ask Anne, and just to know that once you're aware that a business has been attacked, and this might be very case specific, but I'd like to know what can be done at this stage.
So this is where Calvin and I have had some really great conversations. It's my personal view is that it's about controlling the stress response. Now there are things that we will have more or less options in terms of what we choose to do, depending on how well we have prepared. There are aspects around technical preparation. You know, have we segmented our network? Have we got cold storage backups? Have we thought about those things up front and put them in place? If we have, we're in a much better position. But when an organization falls into the category of we're in breach, somebody is coming after us, the organizational response and who in the organization is on point to actually coordinate that. Is there a plan? Have we thought about it up front? And a lot of this is to do with sort of human psychology and our willingness to speak truth to power and to put egos to one side and to acknowledge fears. You know, nobody wants to feel vulnerable. Nobody wants to feel that we have our margin for maneuver constrained. So it's about giving individuals, literally giving people back a sense of agency in a situation where they may not be feeling very competent, where they are feeling vulnerable. I would strongly recommend that all organizations from very small to very large make friends, literally get acquainted with your CSIRT and your CERT at a national level, public sector agency that is there to help you respond. Share the information with them. Now, this is where lawyers sometimes get in the way. Lawyers don't want to share information. But it's not necessarily something that is positive to keep it under wraps. So an organization that finds itself under attack, literally deep breath at a corporate level, and allow the people who know, who might be way lower down the hierarchy, allow them to share what they know, allow them to take control if they know what they're doing. It doesn't have to be CEO level, you know, posturing, pretending that they know best. Allow the people who have the capabilities to actually take charge in that situation, empower them, give them the backup, listen to them, and do call in help. That's very interesting, and thank you so much, Anne. And I'd like to know, and maybe Chris or Calvin, you can respond to this question, but how does such a response might relate to conflict management and negotiations, in your opinion?
Calvin, maybe I'll take that first. We talk about negotiation all the time in our project and in prior work, but it's important to start out by saying that when we talk about negotiation, we don't mean exactly the same thing that most people in the public think negotiation is all about, because most people we find have a fairly constrained view of what negotiation is, and they think it's all about people meeting across a table to try to hammer out an agreement. And to us, that's only one phase of negotiations, and it's the most obvious phase, but there's a lot else going on. Different fields use different languages to describe what happens in dealings between people and dealings between organizations. And our specialty is to try to look at all of it. So I'll give you a quick example of the first time I started thinking about negotiation in and with the military. This was in the early 2000s, and I found myself in discussion with a young US Army officer who had been assigned and promoted to major in the process to teach the first course in negotiation at West Point, which was and is the US preeminent military academy. And he had a problem because the people who were signing up to be cadets at West Point were not interested in negotiation. This was in the wake of the 9/11 attacks, and they wanted to go out and, wreak havoc on somebody. But Len Lera had already served a term as a tour as a company commander in Iraq, and he knew that what was going to happen when they got there would be a lot better if these folks knew how to talk to people. And the first thing that he did before I even got into discussions with him was to rename what he was talking about. So they didn't call the course negotiations. They called it winning the peace. And that was really important in the world they were in. And in fact, it turned out that winning the peace was going to be the central problem in Iraq for decades to come. And as we all know, the US won the war against Saddam Hussein handily with its allies, including Canada, and then did not do so well at winning the peace afterwards. But that started a train of thought, which later resulted in Len, at my invitation, and Andrea Schneider's, sitting down at length to try to analyze how the military used negotiation in a world in which the first thing most military people would have told us was, we don't negotiate. That's not what we're about. Well, we asked Len to think about this, and he wrote a chapter for our first big comprehensive book, which was just eye-popping, because it turned out in military relationships with other military forces, including sometimes forces they were in competition with, but certainly with allied forces, with forces on their own side, with Congress in the US or Parliament in Canada, with other government departments, and with corporations that were supplying them with everything from soup to nuts. All of these were negotiations. And that's really the point here, that negotiation is pervasive across everything that happens. So a big phase of this is one that very few people give adequate attention to, and we would call it preparation, or thinking ahead about conflicts. That's been a line of work for some of us for some time. It's incredibly important in this context. And I think Calvin can speak to what happens when an organization doesn't do that well.
Yeah, I think, Chris, and thank you very much for your detailed response. And it's a fascinating topic and so much to cover. But I'd like maybe to use our time to just start brainstorming about what can be done. And I'll go back to you right away, Calvin, with the questions. Because what we just realized right now in this first 30 minutes, we realized that the Canadian Armed Force and other Western militaries, they're not necessarily well structured to deal effectively with these gray zone threats. And now I'd like to go to the panel and ask each of you what can be done from your perspective. And that's where I go back to you, Calvin. So I just want to know, what are your views in this situation? What can be done in your opinion? How can Canada address and deal more effectively with these threats? And rapidly, in 2 minutes, because we want to save some time also to hear about from our audience.
Yes, and I think my comments are going to be focused in terms of what can be done domestically, because it's different than what can be done abroad. And domestically, there's some parameters and constraints in terms of dealing with it. And I think the first point, and I'll be very brief, is awareness. And in our conversations with some of the people at NATO, they recognize awareness is a huge element in terms of preparing. But I don't think it's the end all be all. The second one that I see where there's a gap in our experience in terms of in our private sector work is, as Chris alluded to, is the whole conflict management negotiation thing. Almost everything that we're seeing that we're private sector and law firms are engaged in hybrid warfare situations, it usually starts in some type of a dispute on a merger acquisition, on a natural resource issue, on a cyber attack. There's a conflict there. And the way that we deal with it, say in terms of the historical, cultural approach of dispute resolution in Western democracies, win-win. probably not the most applicable and effective approach. So I think we have to look at that from a negotiation, conflict management. And lastly, tools. People, most don't even know when they're in a hybrid warfare situation and whether you're using AI or large data or machine learning to kind of identify in terms of your due diligence, when you're actually engaged. Those would be kind of the top three things that I'd be looking at.
Very interesting. Thank you so much, Calvin. And I'd like to hear from a complete different perspective and move on to Senda. And you bring a lot of expertise and insights in these groups in terms of public policy and administration affairs. So in your opinion, and as a non-Canadian, could you tell us in general terms, again in 2 minutes, what type of response could be effective from a policy perspective for the United States or somewhere else, such as Canada? And your microphone is, yes, thank you.
So I speak for those affected who are, as Stephen said, society as a whole. And I ponder how they, public and governments, can be persuaded to care and know about the hybrid warfare consequences and devote resources to respond. And my partners here in some way address this, but from the point of view of doers of it, I'm talking about those people to whom this is done. So I think of hybrid warfare preparedness is not unlike planning for disaster preparedness. And borrowing from that field where silos exist, I think we need to think stratified at different scales from individual to national. And here are some ideas poached from realms more familiar to me. So individuals and organizations and communities need to become proactive and self-reliant, what Anne calls self-agency. It's really important. And engage in action such as their own data protection instead of relying on governments, which is now much the case. At high levels of authority and resources, governments need to institutionalize scanning practices. I'm sure people in the audience do that, but not governments necessarily, identifying how critical systems could be hit and in singly and in percolation fashion, wherein an entire system is suddenly disabled as a result of numerous small, difficult to detect moves over time. We have all become aware of instances of small inimical moves likely to be tips of icebergs. At all levels, governments need to create scenarios for disrupting critical systems such as food, energy, water, communications, banking, and supply chains at different scales. And they need to simulate how to prevent or defend. In some regions, scenarios have helped communities prepare for hurricanes and earthquakes. Those of you involved in security and defense are familiar with scenario works, and so are some businesses and financial institutions. But planners and local governments responsible for life-sustaining networks are way behind. Governments could help decentralize critical networks that propagate failure, such as electricity and food supply, and create plans B for restoring them. One way is to encourage redundancies in critical networks, even though they may reduce economic efficiency. So this is hard work to persuade anybody to have these redundancies in the system.
Thank you, Senda. That's very interesting. I'd like to go back to something that Calvin mentioned. He talked about the tools that might be available to help us identify and mitigate these threats. And Stephen, I'd like to know what we can use that is out there, what kind of tools that is out there already or would need to be developed, in your opinion?
So in terms of technological enablers and tools, the private sector largely dominates the development of those, and the number of tools or brands are growing exponentially. But Calvin has mentioned some big data exploitation, data aggregators, social media exploitation tools to be able to look behind the official Facebook page and understand what's happening behind there, who the actors are, what they're doing. AIs and machine learning to help accelerate, so speeding the process. There's a number of tools that exist, and many are being used by different military forces and NATO around the world. Those are important. There are also, traditionally, the military has used common operating pictures. So bringing all the data and information together, fusing it together to better understand the situation. Those tools exist, and they now cover things like the information environment with things command and control in the information environment. So there's tools to visualize There are non-technological tools like red teaming and wargaming. And I think that traditionally the military has used those well to plan, to trial, to test plans and so forth before the execution. But bringing in non-traditional partners, including the private sector, I think would be useful so that we have a better understanding of the whole picture as opposed to just a military thing. There are additional tools. I think a hierarchy of strategies is important. A national security strategy, a defense strategy. Those are things that we don't necessarily have here. And that would enable and ideally bring in, again, the private sector into the development of those strategies, because they hold an important segment of our vulnerabilities and the opportunities that we can leverage to counter hybrid warfare activities. And finally, some of the tools in the military are the military professional education system. So there is an education system where you go through different professional development cycles. I think those need to be adapted to some extent to better understand negotiation, to better understand conflict resolution, to better understand all these new hybrid threats and how to counter those, as well as a public education program. We don't have an intelligence program in Canada. If there was such a program where government, private sector, public sector individuals came together and were educated in intelligence beyond analysis, but intelligence as a whole, I think that would close some of the gaps and seams that exist between the different stakeholders in this whole game.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I'll interrupt you here, but that was a lot of different ideas that we can have, or different tools we can use. I'd like to go back to Anne, because you mentioned earlier, you talk about the importance of being prepared for those threats. And I'd like to know if you can elaborate a little bit more about preventive actions that could be taken to prevent those threats.
For sure. So it depends on where you are. I think that, what you're going to be able to do. And just to build on what was mentioned by the other panelists, this idea of building connective tissue between different stakeholders is super important, because the attacks are often visible in the private sector, but capabilities are in the public sector. And I'd love to see that being extended so that it becomes much more natural and fluid, for there to be an interaction without there necessarily having been an attack. So that when you're in a position to actually take care of hygiene within your enterprise and put in place what I mentioned earlier, multi-factor authentication, taking care of having a backup of your data, being very clear about what data you have, where it is, your business critical systems, knowing yourself. It kind of goes back to Stoic philosophers, and trying to control what you can control. You can control what you know about yourself. You can control your response. And the basics, it's mind-blowing, at least when I came into security at the beginning and I was learning, the domain expertise, it blew my mind at how little attention good hygiene gets. People don't take care of it, and yet there is so much value, foundational value, that's so essential by taking care of those basics. And when you analyze attacks, very frequently, the initial compromise is not sophisticated. It's what happens afterwards that is, but the initial foothold comes through an unpatched vulnerability, something, a network that hasn't been segmented, a compromised identity because somebody wasn't using a good password. These are all things that can be taken care of. And how can we bring people to take care of those things, remove the element of shame, and get people feeling empowered that this is something that they can do and they should want to. So bring public-private sector together, teaching, enabling, and making sure that it is a shared issue with a shared response, as opposed to making it the shame of an organization that is just unfortunate to find itself in the headlines.
Well, what you say is a perfect link to the next question I wanted to ask Chris. I wanted to know what can be done in terms of creating additional skill set for dealing with these threats. What do you suggest can be done to promote awareness?
Well, that's kind of a core question for our project, and a word that keeps coming up in our internal discussions is humility. We are totally aware that we are a small volunteer group facing an enormous problem, and that there is a need for us to learn. And we're in a learning phase now, and we hope that we will be able to foster the creation of other groups that will know more about specific parts of society than we ever will, and that those groups will take on part of the problem. But one of the things that we have done during the COVID era, before we were able to hold our first meeting, and our first physical meeting was only held in July after we'd been together as a group for more than 2 years, we were, while we were operating remotely, able to create a series of test cases. We had 5 teams working for more than a year to develop cases that were realistic hybrid warfare scenarios. And there are 8 of them. They're highly varied. 2 take place in Nigeria, 1 in Australia, 1's a nuclear power problem. They're all very different. But they were all put together by teams that included at least 2 security experts who had been trained in different domains between the 2 of them, plus 4 or 5 people from different domains of conflict management. And we are now using those cases to prepare a teaching book. So we intend to have a case book that can be used by colleges, universities, military units, anybody who wants to, which we hope to publish in about a year, because there's a fair amount of work that goes into the ancillaries along with the cases. That's one example of how we propose to create methods and tools. There are many others. This webinar is an example.
Maybe I'll give you 30 seconds for the many others. Thank you.
Well, this webinar is an example, and it's only the second time that we have sat down to address a specialized audience, and the first time that we have addressed a military audience. The next time we're talking to a specialized audience will be in about a month, and it will be a New York law and business audience. And we need to work with more groups of this kind, but we also need to create or help create more groups of this kind. And one way we might do that is by finding out who among you, the audience, are interested enough in this to maintain your interest beyond today's discussion. And perhaps you would consider writing to Marc Olivier and telling him that. Because you know where to find him. I'm not that hard to find either. I'm honeyman@convener.com, and I'm happy to hear from you too. But if we can develop lists in different domains of people who have an ongoing interest in this, that begins to give us one of the tools that allow us to create other groups or help them create themselves, and we can help them become multidisciplinary as we are.
Thank you, Chris. And thank you for calling upon the audience to see if they're interested also to participate in this reflection. I want to go back to Senda, and we've talked a lot about possible answers to what we could do, but I want to know what practical difficulties in implementation do you see in all these answers, based on your experience or other public policy initiatives in other fields. If there are any new techniques that might help, can you elaborate about it a little bit more? And your microphone would help.
Yes, thank you, Veronique. In my experience, and likely yours, the audience, persuading people and politicians to act is hugely difficult, especially when problems lack salience and are costly. Hybrid warfare is, as Anne put it, a long game. Response to hybrid warfare encounters similar obstacles to climate change and to natural disasters. And they too are perceived as either not real or out of sight, out of mind. People's immediate concerns take precedence over long-time threats, and politicians do not like to devote efforts to problems when, if successful, they won't get credit. For example, the Y2K response, which was extremely successful, is to this day considered an overhyped problem on which resources were wasted because nothing happened, right? And to this, infrastructure in the US is neglected because investments have no immediate visible benefits and that help re-elect politicians. So hybrid warfare is sort of in this category. Getting people to prepare for rare but very destructive earthquakes, such as the big one expected on the West Coast, is uphill. I'm telling you, it's hard to do what we're trying to do. They have no memory of the last one to help with salience and have a hard time imagining consequences. I call them generational black swans, actually, because they are, though not unique, they are new to each generation that experiences them. However, in Hurricane Alley, where communities get frequently hit and predictably, persuasion is hard for preparing is also hard. It's not much easier. Climate change is interesting. People in the US are aware of it, amazingly aware of it, but it still ranks among last concerns. Like hybrid warfare, it unfolds slowly over time, reducing the credibility of threats. People continue to build along coasts and even on islands, although a sea level rise is predicted. One fix we plan or encourage is local adaptations that pay off both now and later. Fixing obsolete water and sewer infrastructure is an example. It takes a lot of people engaging in advocacy. One colleague, Guy Burgess, calls this a massively parallel strategy. And Chris sort of alluded to it, almost described it to a T. It mimics hybrid warfare because it may be slow, but when it gains traction in numerous communities, it can percolate through an entire region, through a country, and move even politicians to action. And incidentally, percolation of idea among your ranks about hybrid warfare and how to respond might be a result of this wonderful event.
Thank you so much, Sandra. This is fascinating. I'd like to go back to Chris before we move on to the audience questions. And Chris, it's certainly not the first time in your career that you're called upon to address a wicked problem. And you started talking about it a little bit earlier, but can you tell us a little bit more in 2 minutes about your experience in getting people from different fields and across very contrasted occupations and setting to work together on a common issue?
Sure. This is the nuts and bolts part. This is what we actually do in this project, okay? Because we are working on a problem here that clearly cannot be faced within the confines of any one discipline or any one kind of experience. I've been working on problems that have that feature for about 30 years now, and it was well over a decade before I realized what could be done. And I realized what could be done when I found myself in 3 different discussions with 3 different people. And it sounds sort of like the setup to a joke, you know, a business school professor, a law professor, and the chief hostage negotiator of the New York Police Department walk into a bar, you know, and then you play out the joke from there, right? But it's not a joke. These were actually 3 people I was working with and having discussions with, and it turned out that all of them were looking at the concept of reputation for a negotiator, but they were looking at it in totally different ways. The business school professor did very precise controlled lab studies using students. The law professor surveyed hundreds of Chicago lawyers about their reputations among each other and their perception of effectiveness, and was finding that the junkyard dogs did not actually have a good reputation for being very effective among other lawyers. And the chief hostage negotiator of the New York Police Department was convincing me that reputation was not a matter of repeat play as everybody else treated it, because they only saw a given customer once. Nobody becomes a repeat hostage taker in New York because they're all either dead or in jail at the end of one case. So they had discovered that you had to build a reputation as a hostage negotiator for truth-telling and reliability within one case. So how did you do that? I ended up asking the 3 of them to write a chapter together for our first big book. And it was a revelation to me as well as to other people, because the subject got richer by having this combination. And that became a pattern for what we've done since. So we now put together teams that are a lot stranger than the one I named. I mean, I think Stephen may have been a little surprised to find himself working with a cultural anthropologist, a theater director, and some other people in July. And yet this leads to thinking that we could not have done without these kinds of combinations. So that's the way we focus. And we hope to help other people do this too, but we also hope to produce a lot in writing and orally out of these methods ourselves.
Thank you, Chris. And just before we turn the floor to the audience, do you have any closing remarks?
Nope, I think I'll let you go from there.
Thank you so much, Chris. And I'd like to turn to Marc-Olivier and see, do you see any questions that the audience might have sent us during the time our panelists were talking?
Sure. I think I've seen a lot of questions relating to kind of the definitions of these various terms, which may be sometimes a bit vague and kind of catch-all a little bit. So I'm wondering if any of the panelists may kind of expand on this and see what are kind of the overlaps between different terms, and if there's specific kind of definitions that we can work towards and kind of operationalize as in terms of a more practical way.
Yeah, Cal or Stephen, maybe you could be useful to help us define those terms a little bit better.
Well, maybe I can jump in, but in terms of providing a definition, you're absolutely right. And I was reading the questions, and yeah, there is some debate. There's debate as to whether even if hybrid warfare, gray zone warfare is actually new, or just an intensification of things that have always been done in the past. But now there's the tools and the ability to be more persistent, have greater reach into different segments of society and whatever. That whole thing is widely debated. Even in the military, there was arguments about, was it hybrid warfare? Is it gray zone? Is it? I think that there is a hybrid warfare center of excellence in Finland that is producing a lot of good material, a lot of good academic valued material that people can refer back to, where they really do break down, and there is some sort of a coherent perception as to what all of this could be. So rather than me giving you a definition, I think that there are some authoritative bodies that can help answer some of those questions.
Thank you, Stephen. Cal, do you have anything else to add?
No, I'd just say that we've accepted that there's a diversity in terms of definitions, and we've chosen to kind of just accept a very broad definition and accept that there's differing opinions on it.
Thank you, Cal. Marc-Olivier, I'll go back to you. Any other question the audience might have that you see that is something that seems to come back a lot?
I've actually seen a question about the way in which we kind of frame hybrid warfare as something that our adversaries or our kind of rivals use, but that we don't really frame as something that we could actually use ourselves within the confines of our democratic values and the legal frameworks and everything. And it's all often framed as a defensive kind of set of issues. Is there something to be said about kind of, I'm not sure who actually asked this question, but kind of going on the offensive with that and kind of devising an actual foreign policy, defense policy that would use these tools, but in a more kind of a proactive way ourselves?
I think I could speak to that. One of the things that was most startling to read when we were starting this project was a book written 20 years ago or more by two Chinese army colonels. It's called Unrestricted Warfare. There are translations available for free on the internet. And the most startling thing to me about that book was that these two army officers were laying out the case for why China had to get good at hybrid warfare, which they called unrestricted warfare. But their rationale for why China had to take up this line of activity, which it has obviously become very successful at since, was that they felt the Americans and the West in general were already so good at it and were prosecuting it. And one of the things that we have to deal with in reality is the perceptions of our opponents that we are already in this game and have been at it for a long time. The things they perceive us as doing under hybrid warfare, we may innocently believe should not be seen that way. But there are a whole string of Western activities that we might regard as soft power or diplomacy or economic logic, which are seen in very threatening terms by some other people. And if we do not devote some attention to understanding why they think the way they think about what we do, we will never succeed in unpacking the whole picture such that we can really address it.
Thank you, Chris. Stephen, do you want to add to that from your experience perspective?
I'll add a little bit to that. I think the other thing, and different nations in the West are doing it differently, but in Canada, we don't really have a very solid, if at all, national security strategy. That is fundamental to then having all these foreign policy, defense strategies, and all the subordinate strategies that would allow you to actually coordinate, synchronize all the levers of power and all the different elements that could be leveraged in an offensive way to counter the adversary. So I think that lacking that top hierarchy of strategies, which would include the private sector, because I think they're fundamental players in all this. And I think that deficiency does limit our ability to actually execute anything that would be hybrid warfare-ish in an offensive or a proactive way.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Calvin?
Just real quickly, I think quite often we fall into a trap or a rut, sometimes looking at this, as a government responsibility in terms of our approach defensively, offensively. And I think, the origin of Project Shishat actually comes from the boardrooms of C-suites and the boardrooms of law offices, where, to be quite frank, seeing most of the hybrid warfare activities within our nation. They're not going to have conversations with the intelligence agencies because they don't know how to have those conversations. They're not going to the police because we have a legal framework that doesn't allow them to have a conversation that's protected from a reputational risk. So what we're trying to do is provide those communication, conflict management, negotiation, because it's back and forth communication with their partners, with their stakeholders, with the threat actors, and giving them the tools in terms of like building that future, in terms of a strategic capacity that includes awareness, but also skills and tools to be able to not only defend, but maybe in sometimes have an offensive capacity. But I think, right now, sitting in the boardroom of with law firms and with C-suites, right now, they're just looking at a defensive capability because they're getting destroyed.
Thank you, Cal. In the audience, we have Jen James, also talks about the fact that the way we describe the activities of hybrid warfare threat, it covers a wide swath of our economy, from transnational businesses to very local undertakings. And there's a concern that this conversation itself won't resonate with the average business person. And they want to know if we have any suggestions for bridging that gap. So maybe Anne, maybe Cal, you have any ideas regarding that?
So yeah, I understand. I mean, I remember one of the very first conversations I had with Calvin. We were talking about, where we position ourselves on the geopolitical map. The average person watches geopolitics on the news, right, and doesn't think that they are in any way directly concerned. It's education that can't be done one shot. This is, we need to be educating our kids in school about technology. We need to be talking to people in companies and not making security awareness a tick box thing that you do once a year and it's just a compliance obligation. There's a big behavioral aspect in this about what do we know about the psychology of our fellow human beings to get people to care about something ahead of it being a threat to them. It's very abstract. What Sandra was saying, it doesn't seem salient. We have more pressing things to care about. So how do we make it relevant, and making it feel like it's something that we have actually, just on a different point, it's not only about the threat, it's about believing that we have something worth protecting, and mobilizing people around that. And what I found very interesting about Project Seshat is that it's forced me, and I think all of the contributors, to step out of our own context and look at things differently. So what Chris was saying, reading that book about seeing the world through China's eyes doesn't mean we have to accept it as good. We don't have to agree with it. But seeing the world through an entirely different lens is really important to being able then to say, well, how do I make my domain expertise relevant to people who will be affected by this, but currently don't see it as a thing for them? And as a security professional or as a negotiator, the average business person, what do they care about? Well, they care about keeping their business afloat. They care about protecting their employees, being able to pay the wages, being able to sign deals, and framing it in a way that is relevant to that. So it's about having the ability to step out of what we see as our lane and taking our expertise and twisting it, not deforming it, but shaping it in a way that it becomes relevant to a group where we can offer help and where we can offer support.
Thank you so much. And there's a question specifically addressed to Calvin by David Morris. He likes to know how does cybersecurity companies can help their clients on the battlefield with these hybrid threats. What tools are required, and also who in the government is taking care of these threats? What would be your opinion, Cal, about that?
Well, I always say I'm not the tech expert there, and I know David is very much in that software space. But I think the main thing to look at is looking at all these threats, which I don't think we do in Canada. You see them all narrowly defined in terms of bureaucratic silos. Whether it be a cyber threat, whether it be an illicit finance threat, whether it be an espionage threat, and it's all defined. And the main thing I'd be looking at in terms of the cyber threat is looking at it from a holistic perspective, as well as secondly, which Anne mentioned, in terms of looking at the human element aspect of it. And in terms of from a Canadian perspective, I think there's probably a capacity gap there that David's probably alluding to in terms of their capabilities to engage with the private sector. So I think we're seeing more and more, people looking for that gap, but it's an evolutionary kind of movement towards addressing it. And then once you address the cyber gap, it's all the other related activities. And from a hybrid warfare perspective, I think the one thing that we've learned as a group in the first 2 years is usually these activities are all interconnected, and to look at them as individual activities probably is a threat itself.
Thank you, Cal. Cindy, I'd like to hear from you. Maybe you have a few things to say regarding this as well. And yes,
I want to pick up a few loose ends. Thank you, Veronique. One is something that you mentioned earlier, wicked problems. And in my field, they are all wicked, but hybrid warfare is the epitome of a wicked problem. And it has to do with complex systems. That's what makes them wicked, that wherever you tinker, it's going to have a consequence somewhere else that you don't even expect. So that makes it hard to develop best practices or tools that work everywhere. So they rather have to be tailored. Another thing that I want to mention is cultural obstacles. We live in open societies and they are porous, and people are very reluctant to not be that way, which makes for a great field for hybrid warfare. And I just want to tell you that when I came back from the Montreal meeting, I wanted to tell my sons about the wonderful experience, and they said, ah, conspiracy theory. And they are not very special in any way. In other words, it was the great public that responded to me. So to me, that is quite concerning. And I think that I mentioned to you the massively parallel approach where we work from many corners to forward the idea that hybrid warfare exists and is a danger, and to push for people to take charge of their data and their confidentiality and so on at the individual level, not only at organizational levels.
Thank you, Sanda. I have a question that will probably concern Anne, but anybody else can join in, can jump in. It's a question from Kirkpatrick Wheeler. He asked, how much security is necessary? How much security should business people have in a time of hybrid warfare, in your opinion?
So I think the initial thought I have on that is it depends where you are. Context matters. You know, are you in a high trust or a low trust society? You know, I come from Ireland, where people still leave their front doors open, literally. I'm not saying that's a good idea, but it happens. Now, if you contrast that with, say, Johannesburg in South Africa, it's a very different context. So the notion of how much security is necessary, it depends where you are, what you perceive as being your threat environment. The question also is, where does it come from, right? Now, there's a tendency, or it can seem desirable when you're feeling very vulnerable to literally armor up. And the question that I ask often is that the best approach? You know, do we need to wrap ourselves up in layers of security because it can get operationally very expensive, very difficult to manage? Is it effective? And I would bring it back to saying, let's focus on the basics again, right? We were talking earlier about hygiene and thinking through a plan, because your technology might fail, right? So where are we putting the focus? Stop saying that people are the weakest link. We're fundamentally doing this to protect people, allow people to be empowered and rely on them, and give them the basics that will allow them to respond even when the plan falls apart. So I would look a lot at prevention. I would not put so much focus on tooling, and I would allow the collectivity actually to play a bigger role. I do have a very strong intuition that we are not allowing people, companies, and the public sector to interact in a way that is optimal. I think there is the same way, you know, you have a problem, you call your fire department. You're not expecting everybody to run their own fire service. So how can we use that kind of analogy to provide a capability that benefits the collectivity, but still expect people to have fire alarms, you know, not leave matches burning, those kind of things. So it's a shared responsibility, but don't expect people and corporations to do things that they're just not equipped to do.
Thank you, Anne. Stephen, maybe you could add to that from your own perspective.
I think from my experience, I've seen security operations and all these operating in silos, and the security folks will be looking at optimizing or maximizing security and whatever. Really fundamentally, it's all about risk, and it's all about decision makers, whether you're a CEO or a commander. It's all about risk and how much risk you're willing to accept, and then you layer in the security to enable that, as opposed to running in parallel, and they often become very conflictual and sometimes even debilitating. So how much security? It's all about risk and jeopardy, and how much a commander or a decision maker is willing to take.
Thank you, Stephen. We'll take the last audience question from Daniel Stanton, who's asking, he's saying that the absence of an overarching national security strategy, and he's mentioning that the last one was in 2004, is Canada's biggest shortcoming. we need one. So we need a strategy, one that is China-centric. Anyone in this panel has a view about it? It's a huge question.
Well, I can go. I think I've already spoken to it. I think that if you are going to bring all the elements of national power and the private sector to be able to think, understand, and act in a coherent manner, I agree. You need a national security strategy. Should it be China-centric? Not necessarily, but it should be certainly addressing some of the challenges that we've got from a bunch of different actors. And although it is national, and although it is far from small businesses and the people that we're also trying to help, that sets in place the conditions to be able to protect them and to give them the opportunity to exploit the opportunities they need. So I'll pause.
Yeah, and I just add that I agree 100%. Since 2009 and 10, when we started seeing, at least when I started seeing threat actors in the illicit finance world, that was the #1 conversation at the national tables. I'm not sure why there's such a reluctance to discuss it. We quite often attribute it to a certain political party, but that isn't my experience, because there's been lots of political parties since the early 2000s. And none of them have. I think it's a cultural thing, is a big play here in terms of Canadians. And I think, our focus, Project CSHAT, is all about education, looking at the long play, within law schools and business schools to develop the future leaders, so that they're looking at this issue where, say, our current generation and past generations haven't looked at this issue. And that's why we've taken the approach and the strategic approach in terms of playing the long game and taking a chapter of the playbook of China and looking at this as not a 2-year, 4-year issue, but a 20-year, 40-year issue. And that's what we're about.
Thank you so much, Cal. Sandra, you want to add to this?
Yeah, I wanted to add an observation that at least in the United States, I noticed that people are reluctant to name an opponent lest they should be offended. And that handicaps quite tremendously devising any response that is specific to the opponent. And also, I noticed that politics make for strange bedfellows, and that is also somewhat of an obstacle in dealing with this problem, because people have multiple interests that get involved in this, especially politicians, and that maybe handicaps an effective response at the government level.
Thank you so much, Sandra. We've mentioned that we wanted to launch a global dialogue, so we also want to hear from you, the audience. We have over 40 people online right now listening. And one of the first questions we'd like to ask you is, how, in your opinion, can we increase collaboration between military and non-military actors to address the new form of conflict?
I think the best way to respond might be to kind of follow up with either the CDA Institute or Project CSHAT, since we can't have people from the audience speak, but we'll be happy to follow up. But I think we're almost 90 minutes in now, so I think we can probably wrap this up. And thank you very much, everyone, for attending, and a special thanks to our panelists and moderator for what I think was an engaging and very important conversation. And before we let you go, we simply wanted to point out that if you'd like to be notified when we organize events like this one, or when we publish research on related topics, feel free to subscribe to our newsletter through our website, cdainstitute.ca. And you can also learn more about Project CSHAT on project-cshat.org. So thank you, everyone, and we hope to see you again in our future events. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.